wouldn't it be great, in a short space of time, that you could gain the confidence that you want in your improvisation? Imagine busting out a great sounding solo in a jam session. Imagine playing to your family and friends and connecting the music that's in your mind effortlessly to your hands on the fretboard. Well, there is a way, and it's what I'm going to show you in this video. Hello and welcome to video 2 on the big secrets to learning jazz guitar improvisation. This series is all about the shortcuts that you need to do in order to become confident and to be a great sounding jazz improviser. My name's Greg O'Rourke. I'm a professional guitarist and the founder of fretdojo.com. It's a jazz guitar website that's helped thousands of people worldwide improve their jazz guitar skills. In the last video, I emphasised the importance of forming the right neural patterns in your mind as a basis for solid improvisation. In this video though, I'm going to give you the step-by-step process on actually how to develop these important patterns in a systematic way. Before we get into the lesson, I want to tell you a little story of when everything changed in my approach to improvisation and when I quickly started to transition from being frustrated with my playing to being confident and happy with how I was sounding. But you're not going to believe me, because this story, well, it starts in ancient India. Okay, so apart from playing jazz guitar all day, and yeah, I do have other hobbies, would you believe, is studying the ancient yogis of India. I've always found it really interesting. Now, one day I was sitting down with a book on ancient Indian science and metaphysics, as you do, and something really just leapt out of the page at me when I was reading this book, and it was a Indian philosophy called the philosophy of the 4 elements. Now, let me just explain this to you really briefly. The ancient yogis believed that any phenomena, anything you can see, is comprised of 4 basic elements, which is earth and water, fire and air. So when you have these in combination, it creates something. So it's a little bit cryptic. What it really means is the earth element is the kind of the solid aspect of something. The water is the fluid aspect of something. The fire, the temperature, and the air, how something moves. But, you know, that's by the by. Now, why am I talking about this? Why am I kind of taking up your time talking about this? Because when I read that, I had this crucial realization about learning jazz guitar, is that maybe jazz guitar improvisation could be, you know, deconstructed in a similar approach. And I realized by coincidence there were 4 basic elements to learning to improvise. They are vocabulary, the jazzy sounds of jazz, you know, how to get those sounds into your guitar playing. There's also technique, you know, you have to have reasonable technique to improvise. It's not for a guitarist that's just been playing for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. You need to have a considerable playing experience under your belt. Now, the third element is fretboard knowledge. Now, that's knowing where the names of the notes are on the fretboard, of course, but more importantly, knowing how the fretboard is laid out, knowing how the scale patterns relate to each other and in each key, and knowing how the chords in each key relate to the scale shapes. And this is a very important one. Now, finally, the last element is play, because you can know your fretboard, you've got your technique, and you've got lots of vocabulary, but if you don't have that kind of creative play in your approach to learning to improvise, you'll just end up running jazz licks up and down the fretboard, and you won't really be creative with the material at all. So that's the final element, and a very important one indeed. And so lo and behold, I'd created the 4 elements framework. And this was the system that I've used to rapidly build my abilities as an improviser on the guitar. So this was the crucial realization. Improvisation is actually the result of these 4 elements. Improvisation isn't something that comes out of thin air. You have to make sure that all the ingredients are in order. Then jazz improvisation is the natural result. So this is very different from how most guitarists try to learn improvisation. They study all the scales, arpeggios, they study the jazz theory dictionary, and then they try to make all that sound like jazz. And it doesn't work, because scales and arpeggios are fretboard knowledge. Maybe their technique as well, and you might even be trying to be creative with them and playing with them. But it will never sound like jazz, because scales and arpeggios are not vocabulary, the last element. So if you've been trying to improvise with scales and arpeggios and it hasn't worked for you, this is why. Because you haven't been focusing on that crucial vocabulary. Okie dokie, so let's do this now. Let's do a case study on how to learn to improvise over a chord progression using the 4 elements framework as our method for doing it. Now, we're going to focus in this case study on just a simple major 2-5-1, but this is an important one to focus on as it's one of the most important chord progressions in jazz. All right, let's have a look. Alrighty, so let's look at 4 steps that I would use to building the ability to solo over this major 2-5-1 progression. So here we have a 2-5-1 in D major. The E minor 7 is the 2 chord, A7 is the 5 chord, and then D major 7 is the 1 chord. All right, now the first step that I would use is, out of the 4 elements framework, is look at fretboard knowledge as the foundation. Okay, so this won't really sound like jazz yet, but it'll get our bearings on the fretboard. And this is the failure point for a lot of people trying to improvise on guitar. They haven't sorted out clearly the layout of the fretboard to be able to improvise confidently. So the first thing I would do is just practice the scale shape. I'm going to start on the lowest root note that is coloured red on the diagram. So that's the D note on the 5th fret with my 2nd finger. Here we go. And then I'll go down to the lowest note and finish on the root note. It's good to practice these scales on starting and ending on a root note so that you can really hear the sounds of that scale in its natural state. If I started on the lowest note of the pattern, you'd end up with a mode of the scale. So now what I'm going to do is just do some simple basic improvisation using this scale pattern. Now, I'm not going to put the pressure on myself to make it sound like jazz, because it won't. There's no vocabulary yet. Okay, so let's put on a backing track with this chord progression and we'll just see what that sounds like. So as you could hear, that sounded pretty vanilla indeed. There wasn't very much happening there. I was just running the scale pattern up and down. It's a good start though, but we need to bring this closer to emphasizing the chord changes, which just playing a scale or a mode up and down definitely won't do. So we need to add another approach on top of this when we're looking at that first element of fretboard knowledge. And I've got a great trick for you here. This is using chord shapes. So let's have a look at what I mean here. So seriously guys, this is one of the best tricks in the book. Okay, so here we had that scale pattern that was around the 5th fret in D major that we were just using to solo over the 2-5-1 progression. But watch this. Now, kind of hidden in that scale pattern is actually the chord shapes that outline the harmony of that progression, as if I was comping over the changes in the rhythm section. So let's check it out. So for the 2 chord, we could make a E minor chord with the root note on the 7th fret. For the A7 chord, see how that kind of also lives in that same area, that same scale pattern. It's just kind of hiding in there. Now finally, and the D major 7 chord can also be played in the same fretboard area as the scale pattern. That's a very common shape. So this is one of the best tricks in the book, because if you can visualize those chord shapes when you solo, you'll be able to target the most important tones out of each chord because you're looking at the actual chords on the fretboard. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so here's the comping. That's the 2, 5, and 1 chord. I'll show you again. E minor, A7, D major 7. Okay, now I'm going to kind of mix the comping with the soloing. Okay, now let's just get rid of the chords and just use the visualization of the shapes as a guide. So as you could hear, that's starting to sound a little bit stronger now. It sounds like it's emphasizing the notes out of the harmony. Let's now look back at our 4 elements framework and see what elements we just worked out over the last couple of steps. So I would say so far we've had a good look at fretboard knowledge through practicing that scale shape and then doing a little bit of chord tone work. We've also probably worked out our technique a bit as well, and also the play element a little bit too. But there is one element that's been severely lacking so far, and that's why it hasn't been sounding too crash hot yet. And that's because it's missing this one, the vocabulary. And that's what we're going to look at now. So this is the key transition. And for a lot of you that are wondering, how do I make scales and arpeggios sound like jazz? If you're asking that question, you probably haven't been focusing on building vocabulary. And by that I mean learning some very strong jazz licks. So here's a jazz lick that you can see on the screen now that I've transcribed off a recording. Let me play it to you first. It goes like this. Now, the tab is quite important actually if you're going to learn this one. I've deliberately fingered this lick to take advantage of the layout of the scale pattern that's the one that we were practicing in step 1. And also in step 2, those underlying chord shapes. Watch what happens when I play this lick but put the chords at the start of each bar. So this is an extremely secure way to improvise because you're able to visualize those chord shapes as you play the line. And it's much, much more secure than only relying on sort of like a scale pattern to navigate. I find that the scale pattern sits more in the background, but I'm really thinking about those actual physical chord shapes on the guitar, even as I play single lines. Now what's cool about this is that, this is a nice primer for chord melody guitar, because if you learn vocabulary in a system like this, you could always play the chords at the same time as the line, you know? So it's an excellent way to learn vocabulary by tightly visualizing the chord shapes and scale patterns as a way to navigate and remember the material. So this was Joe Pass's big secret, relating any lick you learn to the underlying chord shapes to help you remember where it lies on the fretboard. If you're only going to get one thing out of this video series, that would be it. So we've started to come a long way here. We've learnt the layout of the fretboard, and we've also learned a great sounding lick. But you know, there's something missing here. Like if I just solo with that, it's just going to sound like I'm running that lick up and down the fretboard without really doing anything to it or making it my own. So let's revisit the 4 elements one last time, because I think we're missing a step. Let's have a look. So we already had our fretboard knowledge and we worked on our technique, and now we've got that crucial element of vocabulary. But there is one left that we have to work on, and it's this one, of course, the play element. So we need to figure out some practice techniques to get a bit more creative with these lines, okay? But remember what we covered in video number 1 of this series. So at the moment, we've just got one line, but we haven't, you know, varied it up at all or been creative with it. And furthermore, we haven't got any other lines yet. But look what happens if we start adding more and more lines. More and more connections and overlaps will occur in the material we've learned. But as a secure backdrop, and this is what we didn't really talk about in video number 1, is we have that essential fretboard knowledge of knowing those chord shapes that are on that fretboard in that position, and also the scale shape as a backdrop. And that will give us this rock solid foundation, kind of like the guide rails for improvising, and it's going to make the whole thing really easy. Okay, so this is step 4 now. We're going to add more vocabulary to the mix. Here's another line that I've transcribed from a recording. It sounds like this. And the fingering that's on the tab there is clearly relating it to chord shapes I know. So this starts on the root note of that one, or otherwise you could actually kind of relate it to a triad shape there. This is kind of like an A7 shape and the 7 with your little finger. Okay, and then kind of having a like that kind of shape as the final one. So I've related this new lick to the fretboard, but what I can do is start to vary it up a little bit. When I play over a backing track, I don't just have to play this line over and over again. That's really boring. But what I can do is start to vary the notes, start to change the rhythm, start to change where I start playing the lick in the progression. And even just with this single line, you can have quite a lot of creativity around it. Let's have a look. So that was just a straight line, but I could just start it in a different spot. Change some notes. So even just with one line, you can use that as a rough guide, but kind of improvise notes around that general idea. But let's have a look at another approach now. We can take the line we first learnt in this video, which was this one. So what I could do is cross-pollinate them. Like I could then take this line that's on your screen now and play it by finishing it with the other one, something like this. That sounded really nice. Or I could start the other way around. Start with the previous line and finish with this one. Yeah, that kind of worked as well. So now I'm going to show you that over a backing track. Now, I've now got all the raw material I need. I just need to be creative with it. So I'm going to mix up the lines. I'm going to vary the ones that I've got. I'm also going to think about the chord tones, those chord shapes in the background as I play, all to give me the firm basis for navigating these changes with confidence. Let's have a look. So there you have it, a rock solid method for creative improvising over a 2-5-1, using only 2 licks as a starting point. To achieve this, we combine the 4 elements of fretboard knowledge, technique, vocabulary, and play. So will this 4 elements framework work for you? It definitely will. It's worked for many students I've taught over the years, and it can help you too. It's a surefire way to quickly focus on the key elements to learning jazz guitar improvisation, because it's very easy to get overloaded and distracted from the immense amount of conflicting and contradictory advice from approaching jazz guitar improvisation that's out there at the moment. You just need to focus on these 4 elements: vocabulary, technique, fretboard knowledge, and play. So this video went through a step-by-step process on how to solo over a major 2-5-1 progression in a single fretboard position, using a couple of licks, right? But what about the other fretboard positions? What about the other chord progressions? And what about more vocabulary? You know, we've only learnt a little bit so far. The next video in this series is going to show you the roadmap for how you can learn all of this so you can become the improviser that you want to be. I think you're going to find this third and final video of this series pretty interesting indeed. So please leave a comment below this video to let me know what you thought about it and if you have any questions about this approach. My name's Greg O'Rourke and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.